Chapter 16, Lessons from the New Communist Movement. Because the new communist movement left such a scant institutional legacy, today's activists have almost no vehicles for sustained interaction with a sizable group of movement veterans. Young radicals are more likely to encounter organizations that carry on the legacy of social democracy, mainstream communism, or Trotskyism. This disparity also exists in the literature about the U.S. left. While many books examine the experience of these other trends, very little has appeared that analyzes the new Marxist efforts of the 1970s. This deficiency is unfortunate. The new communist movement offers today's left a rich source of lessons, positive as well as negative, especially so since the experiences of many young radicals bear important similarities to that earlier wave of rebellious youth. The late 60s radicalization was galvanized by the freedom struggles of people of color in the U.S. and across the globe, and the generation of 1968 tried to build something new because no existing political trend seemed in harmony with that upsurge or able to provide guidance. Additionally, the late 60s surge toward a new revolutionary paradigm was catalyzed by the sharp contrast between the misery spread by capitalism versus the narrow boundaries of U.S. politics as usual, and by the chasm between the intensity of resistance by the world's dispossessed versus the relative caution, inertia, and more privileged social base of existing left organizations. Several ingredients of that same volatile mix exist today. The polarization between wealth and poverty, within the U.S. and worldwide, is even greater than it was in the 1960s, and this gap is inextricably intertwined with both capitalism and racism. Electoral politics have become more dominated than ever by naked wealth, and millions of people are completely alienated from the political system. Once again, the small groups that comprise the organized left lack broad influence, especially within communities of color and among the poorest paid, most exploited workers. And as in the late 1960s, the progressive movement is badly divided along racial lines. What's missing from this picture are the kind of large-scale, sustained protest movements that arose in the 1960s. Unless and until such movements develop, projections that masses will turn to radical alternatives remain idle speculation, but it is not unreasonable to expect heightened struggles down the road, not least because all historical experience indicates that sooner or later drastic inequities lead to resistance. Closer to the moment, even in the economic boom years of the 1990s, battles were waged that produced pockets of young people interested in revolutionary ideas. From protests against the Gulf War to battles led by youth of color against anti-immigrant and anti-affirmative action propositions to labor organizing campaigns rooted among immigrant workers. And the fall 1999 Seattle protests against the World Trade Organization have already been called a turning point in putting the issue of corporate-led globalization on the popular agenda. It is thus quite possible that the next decade will include grassroots movements that produce new layers of energetic radicals. And if so, it is unlikely that the majority will simply adopt the left perspectives currently on offer and join existing socialist organizations. Rather, most will search for fresh perspectives and organizational forms. Of course, to a degree, every new generation reinvents the left, whether by transforming existing groups or by forming new ones of their own. This is both necessary and positive, not least because youth are far less likely than veterans to be shackled by the tradition of all the dead generations, which weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living, as Marx put it. This is especially crucial today, since at no time since the birth of the modern socialist movement has the left needed such a top-to-bottom overhaul. But freeing the left from the shackles of perspectives gone by does not mean ignoring the past, but rather learning what has worked and what has failed, and why. Combining new left and old left strengths, this very point is one of the most important lessons from the evolution of the 1960s new left and its new communist offshoot. The breaking continuity between the old and new lefts and the mainly unproductive relationships between veteran and new generation activists, examined in Maurice Isserman's If I Had a Hammer, The Death of the Old Left and the Birth of the New Left, were major factors in shaping the early New Left's trajectory. These same problems carried over and affected the way those who turned to revolutionary politics in 1968 to 1973 came to view Marxism, the Old Left, and their own experience. A more knowledgeable early New Left might have developed sounder politics and more grounded strategies, and activists coming out of such a New Left might have been able to avoid some of the blunders of the new communist movement when faced with the challenges of 1968 and after. Isserman's book concludes, as its inheritance from the Old Left, the New Left took to heart those lessons that in the short run that allowed it to grow spectacularly, but not the lessons that in the long run might have allowed it to survive fruitfully. In a final footnote, He quotes these words from one-time studies on the left editor James Gilbert. Thinking back on the 1960s, I see this period as one of enormous energy and change, of a movement in civil rights that altered American history as much as anything had ever done, but I also see it as a profoundly apolitical decade, nothing in its premises or effects like the 1930s during the heyday of the old left. And I am forced to wonder what might have happened, what might still happen, if the moral energy of the 1960s were ever joined to the political shrewdness of the 1930s. Though neither Isserman nor Gilbert would likely agree, the new communist movement represented the most sustained 1960s-based effort to bring together precisely that combination. In its formative period, the movement showed some promise that it could accomplish this synthesis. But despite a prodigious outpouring of thought and hard work, this promise was not realized, and the movement foundered, a complicated moment. In analyzing the reasons for that failure, the actual conditions facing the aspiring revolutionaries of 1968 to 1973 must be the starting point. It was an extremely complicated and contradictory moment. More than a decade of large-scale popular mobilization had made the conformist 1950s a dim memory. Vital pillars of U.S. capitalism, racist social relations at home and military intervention in the Third World had become targets of nearly continuous mass protest. Progressive movements had taken root or were emerging within every community of color, among women, among gays and lesbians, in the military, in the prisons, in the welfare lines, on college campuses, in high schools, and among youth generally. There was a rebirth of labor militancy and even a measure of dissent within labor officialdom. Anxieties and divisions within the ruling class, especially over foreign policy, were greater than they had been in decades. Further, left-wing movements held considerable initiative worldwide. With the Vietnamese Revolution in the forefront, armed struggle against Western domination raged through much of the Third World. The USSR, Eastern Europe, China, and several other Third World countries had already been lost, and it seemed only a matter of time before imperialism's orbit was reduced even further. Analysts across the political spectrum believed that looming defeats would exacerbate already severe U.S. economic problems, mounting trade deficits, inflation, falling profit margins, and the sharpened class, racial, and political polarizations at home. Moreover, out of the 1960s protests, a new revolutionary current had emerged, its core numbered in the thousands and its supporters in the tens of thousands, and it included organizers with influence in every social movement of the period. These encouraging developments, partly because they had been so unexpected just a decade before, were in the forefront of most activists and much of society's political thinking, but there were other, less obvious and less positive sides to the picture. Third World movements for self-determination did not actually have the economic base to achieve the results revolutionaries hoped for and imperialists feared. Rather than beginning a new wave of innovative socialist projects, the 1970s national liberation victories proved to be the final phase of the post-World War II decolonization movement. While the Vietnamese and other communist-led struggles were able to achieve national independence, no small accomplishment, they were not able to break free of the capitalist-dominated world economy. Moreover, this limitation was closely connected to the structural weaknesses of the largest countries that had embarked on the socialist path. During the 1970s, deep-seated flaws in the economic and political model employed by both the USSR and China began to eat away at the apparent stability of those societies. Further, Moscow and Beijing were so hostile to each other that they were unwilling to make common cause against imperialism, qualitatively weakening the International Progressive Front. In the U.S., meanwhile, the guardians of capitalism were revising their strategies and maneuvering to regain the initiative. Some retrenchments, cutting U.S. losses, and withdrawing from Southeast Asia were required, and so was a more sweeping economic restructuring after the long post-war boom ended in 1973. But the technological, financial, political, and ideological reserves at capital's disposal meant that, after considerable scrambling, these adjustments could be made without the level of shock and crisis that the left and many others had anticipated. Plus, a host of factors were at play that made translating popular discontent into durable radical allegiance a formidable task. These had deep roots in U.S. history, the weakness of the socialist tradition in the working class, and in contrast, the widespread consensus behind an essentially pro-imperial version of patriotism, the pervasive racial fault lines that, among other things, led so many white workers to believe they have more in common with their white bosses than with their non-white co-workers, a deeply entrenched two-party, winner-take-all electoral arrangement that forms a tremendous obstacle to radicalism's ability to gain any kind of stable institutional footing in the political system. Beginning in 1972 to 1973, these factors and others began to take their toll when the popular insurgencies that had blossomed in the 1960s lost momentum, and Democratic Party liberals succeeded in redirecting protest energy back into safer political channels. Simultaneously, social forces were on the rise that would make the most important motion of 1970s U.S. politics a substantial turn to the right. The legions of the new right were on the advance, as were the closely connected advocates of racial backlash, and these were tucked into a broader mobilization by the much expanded middle strata behind to have politics antagonistic to the interests of people of color and the poorer sectors of the working class. So strong was this motion, and so weak the bonds of solidarity within the working class, that a section of the traditional New Deal coalition, especially suburban white skilled workers, was conscripted to the have side. By the end of the 1970s, that old coalition was in tatters, replaced as the dominant alignment in U.S. politics by the pro-inequality, militarist, and overtly anti-labor coalition that elected Ronald Reagan. Every left-wing tendency thrown up by the tumultuous 1960s faced these complex and difficult realities of the 1970s. None had or could have had a full understanding of the circumstances at hand. All chose their path based on a perspective that grasped one or another aspect of the situation more clearly than others. The young revolutionaries who turned to Third World Marxism, and those who embraced party building in particular, focused mainly on the positive elements in the early 1970s mix, especially on the dynamism they saw in people of color movements at home and national liberation movements abroad. They had some appreciation for the challenges of winning a majority of the U.S. population to socialism, but this appreciation was shallow because they did not grasp how atypical the 1960s had been relative to the long view of U.S. history. Most realized that a slacking off of popular movements was on the immediate horizon, but they believed this ebb would be both temporary and followed by more large-scale upheavals as Washington faced further defeats in the Third World. Altogether, it was a plausible hypothesis, and it led thousands of thoughtful organizers to try to consolidate the revolutionary ranks, give revolutionary politics a strong institutional expression, and work to win millions to a revolutionary view. Furthermore, Third World Marxism seemed to offer the perfect framework for success. It put the cutting-edge questions of racism and imperialism central to political strategy. It linked U.S. radicalism with surging Marxist-led movements in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, and promised a break with Eurocentric one-sidedness. It illuminated a path to building a multiracial movement out of what had evolved as a racially segregated left. Third World Marxism anchored itself in the aspirations of the world's most downtrodden and dispossessed, while calling for the unity of every oppressed person in a project of universal human emancipation. This was the source of its tremendous political and moral appeal, and for the party builders within the Third World Marxist milieu, Leninism offered a program for giving these sentiments a powerful organizational expression. It was urgent to prepare a vanguard to be ready for the next round of mass upheavals, the 1905 to 1917 analogy, so that in tandem with the rising of the Third World, U.S. revolutionaries could lead a bid for political power. But rational though this scenario seemed, it was not on the mark. Especially in hindsight, it is clear that the obstacles to the consolidation of a mass revolutionary current were much greater, and the favorable factors much weaker, than virtually the entire left then believed. Indeed, even if the young organizers of 1968 had somehow attained a better understanding of the difficulties they faced, the challenges to establishing a durable revolutionary pole within mass politics would have been extremely formidable. It would have required tremendous tactical and ideological flexibility, not to mention keeping a unique critical distance from all the far more powerful and prestigious parties that then dominated the international socialist movement. No left tendency managed this feat. Indeed, it would have required a different formulation of the left's basic 1970s task. Aspiring revolutionaries would have had to reject the idea that the immediate priority was to consolidate a vanguard organization in preparation for not too distant revolutionary upheavals. Instead, they would have had to grasp in timely fashion the fact that large-scale social forces were driving U.S. politics to the right, and that for a lengthy period galvanizing resistance to the conservative onslaught would be the main political task. Toward that end, they would have had to prioritize uniting diverse tendencies into a mass-based radical current that was rooted in anti-racism and anti-imperialism, and able to establish some kind of institutional foothold in mainstream politics. They would have had to develop the tactical finesse to take part in extremely broad political coalitions while retaining the capacity to present anti-capitalist perspectives and engage in consistent popular mobilization. Within such a project, there would be space to try to carve out a more closely knit revolutionary tendency, and indeed such a tendency might be crucial to functioning effectively in a broader alignment, or even in such an alignment taking viable shape. But unless the more broad-based project was kept in the forefront, the actual balance of forces virtually guaranteed failure on every level. The essential failure of the new communist movement, then, is not that it did not successfully build a vanguard that influenced millions of workers, much less that it did not lead a social revolution. Rather, it is that the movement was unable to accurately assess the conditions it faced, either initially or after a few years of inevitable mistakes and misjudgments, and instead pursued strategies and tactics that squandered its initial energy, dedication, and potential. As a result, it was unable to develop approaches, alliances, and organizational forms that could have maximized popular resistance to the 1970s right-wing onslaught and consolidated at least a few thousand cadre into a flexible, grassroots-based, intellectually alive and init for the long-haul revolutionary current. Perhaps a meshing of 1960s revolutionary passion with the old left's sense of historical perspective could have produced a critical mass of multiracial cadre oriented in this more realistic direction. But as noted throughout this book, the disconnect between the new left and the previous radical generation, in particular its largest and most experienced contingent, the CPUSA, compelled the revolutionaries of 1968 to develop a synthesis and strategy mainly on their own. They thought long and hard, but as things turned out, the cadre who built the new communist movement adopted a one-sided and over-optimistic sense of the possibilities at hand. They were hardly the first to make this mistake. Marx, Lenin, and the communists of the 1930s all thought in their turn that capitalism was on the verge of decisive defeats. But though the revolutionaries of 1968 followed in honorable footsteps, their misjudgment was nonetheless costly. It led to unrealistic projections about the balance of class forces, a serious misassessment of the main direction of 1970s politics, ultra-left tactics and mass movements, and sectarian policies toward progressive reformers and other tendencies on the left. It fostered hyperinflated rhetoric, organizational structures, and an overall style of work that was out of touch with the sentiments of the social base the revolutionaries were trying to reach. Further misassessment of the historical moment pushed the new communist movement toward ideological frameworks that reinforced rather than tempered their voluntarist bent. The grip of those frameworks, in turn, made it harder rather than easier to readjust as the 1970s unfolded differently than these young revolutionaries had anticipated. The role of Maoism. The most damage was done by Maoism. The turn to Maoism seemed sensible at a time when the Third World was aflame with armed struggle, and the Chinese Communist Party presented itself as both the champion of national liberation and the initiator of a new bottom-up socialist model. The layer of U.S. activists moving most rapidly leftward was overwhelmingly young, not rooted in the traditional working class, and overflowing with moral fervor. So it was not surprising that many were attracted to an ideology that proclaimed that all the truths of Marxism could be summed up as to rebel is justified, that stressed the power of correct ideas to transform reality almost regardless of objective conditions, that presented nationalism in the most positive light and obscured the distinction between radical nationalism and working-class politics, and that glided over the complexities of Marxist theory in favor of the pithy slogans in Mao's Little Red Book. In the short run, Maoism gave a big forward push to many young revolutionaries' enthusiasm, but by the mid-1970s its drawbacks had come to the fore. For starters, U.S. Maoism's support for China's disastrous policy of alignment with the Washington took a terrible toll. Indeed, pioneer anti-revisionist Harry Haywood eventually concluded that this factor lay at the heart of the movement's demise. While many problems contributed to the crisis of the new communist movement, the underlying cause of its collapse was the incorrect strategic line of the three worlds theory, which are part of the party-building movement uncritically adopted from the Chinese. This view that the Soviet Union is a social imperialist country in which capitalism has been restored marked for the Chinese a fundamental change in the international balance of forces. It portrayed the Soviet Union not only as an enemy but the main enemy of the world's people. There was a logic inherent in the three worlds theory which pushed it in the direction of class collaboration and an underestimation of U.S. imperialism, but the belief that capitalism has been restored in the Soviet Union essentially comes from an idealistic concept of socialism. Haywood's indictment of the analytic errors and negative consequences of the three worlds theory is on the mark. But Maoism's problems went even deeper, as recognized during the CPML's late 1970s crisis by one of China's most prominent supporters from the mid-1970s, CPML, leader and call-editor Dan Burstein. In the Chinese experience, we thought we found the answer. The early ideas about what a party should be, how to make a revolution, how to look at philosophical and ideological questions, etc., were largely conditioned by the model offered by the Cultural Revolution. We're probing a little more deeply into the way the line of the Cultural Revolution negatively influenced US, it is easier to see the whole system of ultra-left ideas and practice that often characterized our work. There were ideas that the history of any party is chiefly a history of two-line struggle, that there is a constant struggle between representatives of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat inside the party, that every single idea is stamped with a brand of a certain class. These concepts led US to an untenable situation in terms of being able to have real debate and democracy. Another premise of the Cultural Revolution was the view that existing institutions and organizations were corrupt and reactionary almost across the board, and should be replaced wholesale by new pure proletarian ones. There is a close connection here to our zeal to set up new independent organizations and movements without much to back them up besides political line, the near mystical quality. Ties ascribed to Mao Zedong thought by the Cultural Revolution contributed to our tendency to look on Marxism-Leninism more as a religion than a science. Maoism's problems were crystallized in Mao's Cultural Revolution slogan that the correctness or incorrectness of the ideological and political line decides everything. This dictum was cited endlessly by the main Maoist groups, despite the fact that it completely ignored material conditions and the balance of political forces, and was on its face a break from Marxist materialism. Neither Marx nor Lenin nor even Mao himself during the period when he was leading the armed struggle that resulted in the Chinese Revolution's 1949 triumph ever penned such an utterly idealist bromide. As such, it not only fostered ultra-left analyses and tactics, but a theoretical purism that led directly to bitter confrontations over even minor points of doctrine and constant inter-organizational competition, a misdirected quest for orthodoxy. Though Cultural Revolution Maoism dominated the early new communist movement, there were also tendencies that were more comfortable with traditional Stalinism or the views of the Cuban communists. And after the rupture over China's foreign policy in the mid-1970s, an entire trend tried to develop non-Maoist versions of anti-revisionism. A few organizations looked to the post-Cultural Revolution CPC for inspiration. To varying degrees, these tendencies avoided the worst of Maoist ultra-leftism, but each alternative had grave problems of its own. Traditional Stalinism pushed in the direction of even greater dogmatism, rigidity, and restrictions on democracy. Partisans of the post-Cultural Revolution CPC founded on Beijing's alignment with Washington and its steady abandonment of socialism in favor of integration into the world capitalist economy. Groups that tried to reinterpret the theoretical principles of the Cultural Revolution in a manner that was not ultra-left got caught in a morass of theoretical inconsistency. And although the Cuban Revolution as well as the Vietnamese CP and African revolutionaries such as Emma Clark Cabral displayed great creativity and more consistent internationalism than either China or the USSR, they neither offered or claimed to offer a comprehensive framework for the international left, and there was an even more fundamental problem. Advocates of all these perspectives accepted the notion that there was one and only one revolutionary tradition, and that there existed a single genuine Marxism-Leninism that embodied its accumulated wisdom. They all believed that upholding their favored version of genuine Marxism-Leninism was the key to building a revolutionary movement. This established a never-ending quest for orthodoxy and a constant suspicion of heresy at the very center of the movement's outlook. But this entire framework, shared though with different post-1917 icons by pro-Soviet communism and Trotskyism, is fatally flawed. The conditions of economic, political, and social life are so marked by constant change, and the history of popular and revolutionary movements is simply too complex for there to be one pure tradition embodying all essential truths. A great deal can be learned from previous left experience. An identification with the history of the revolutionary movement can be a great source of strength. The contributions of Marx and Lenin still shed light on the workings of capitalism and the process of social change. They stand out for their breadth of vision and insistence on linking theory, practical work, and organization building in an internationalist project. But it is an unwarranted leap from there to belief in a single and true Marxist-Leninist doctrine with an unbroken revolutionary pedigree from 1848 to the present. This nevertheless was the mindset of the new communist movement, and it had profound and negative consequences. Even when activists learned through bitter experience that a particular system of orthodoxy was fundamentally flawed, impulses to break with dogmatism and explore new theoretical terrain were overwhelmed by the push to find another orthodoxy. From one angle, the history of the movement boils down to a series of such shifts, with each juncture seeing a previously dominant group fall by the wayside and a new organization rise to proclaim that at last the true path had been found. From the early 1970s to the 1980s, this process was repeated again and again, each time with more fallout. By the late 1980s, too little energy or confidence was left for another cycle. Additionally, this theory is orthodoxy mindset prevented the new communist movement from making any new and significant intellectual contribution to the left's understanding of US society. In contrast to nearly every other 1970s, early 1980s US left tendency, the new communist movement produced almost nothing in the way of original studies illuminating new features of U.S. social and economic development or hidden chapters of U.S. history. A few thoughtful works were produced by independent Marxist-Leninists or individuals associated with some of the movement's atypical groups, the Democratic Workers' Party, Sojourner Truth Organization, and Line of March. But the publishing houses of the main new communist organizations issued almost nothing that remains of value to serious left researchers and scholars. The movement's narrow conception of revolutionary theory also contributed mightily to its descent into the sect-building trap. For a sect, allegiance to past doctrine takes priority over engaging with current reality. Doing battle with heresy takes precedence over finding common ground with others. Control over affiliated mass organizations is equated with leading popular movements. Most of the largest groups avoided the worst manifestations of sectarianism for at least few years, but even the most broad-minded ultimately succumbed to the lure of such a mechanical and miniaturized version of Leninism. Indeed, at the very moments when the most promising organizations seemed on the verge of breaking out of their sect mentality, they typically became dizzy with their small-scale success and lost sight of the tremendous distance between their initial accomplishments and what it would take to become a historically significant force. Instead of accepting and grappling with all the complexities that accompany building deep ties to the working class, they retreated to the safe ground of doctrinal purity and of being a big fish in a small pond. From the outset, some voices called for a different kind of engagement with the inherited traditions of Marxism-Leninism, but the cadre and friendly critics who warned that the movement was making fundamental errors were unable to forge a viable alternative. Some were able to sustain local organizing collectives for a few years, and others managed to publish insightful journals. Here, Radical America stands out for voicing an anti-dogmatic working-class view throughout the 1970s, but none of them reached the minimum threshold of numbers, multiracial composition, or coherence to challenge anti-revisionism's hegemony among those seeking a collective, working-class-based revolutionary project. Since 1989 to 1990, few activists have gravitated toward Maoism or any other variant of Marxism-Leninism. Indeed, it is extremely unlikely that many people radicalized in the coming decade will turn in that direction. The collapse of the USSR, China's reliance on capitalist methods, the absence of a powerful constellation of communist-led national liberation movements, these and other changes mean that Leninism is nowhere near the pole of attraction it was in the late 1960s. But voluntarism, dogmatism, sectarianism, and undemocratic practices are afflictions that can be rationalized by a multitude of ideological prescriptions, not just Marxism-Leninism. They have hardly been eliminated from popular movements, and it can only help to record one more warning of their destructive power. Furthermore, the tendency to reduce the complex process of building a radical organization to a simplistic recipe for sect building, as well as the temptation to see the demise of capitalism as only one more big mass upheaval away, are hardly blunders that come only in packages labeled Maoist fundamentalism. Activists beware, to the contrary, they have arisen in different forms over many decades. They reflect deep-going spontaneous sentiments among individuals first turning to revolutionary politics, especially youth radicalized in any tumultuous period when the injustices of society loom much larger than long-range historical perspectives. For these reasons, ultra-left and dogmatic perspectives were deeply absorbed by the young activists who forged the new communist movement, though the rhetoric and reasoning justifying their course was specific to their situation, time, and place. One of the valuable lessons from this movement, then, is how profoundly a flawed ideological framework can undercut even the most dynamic movement. Some positive lessons, valuable as they are, lessons from the negative side of the movement's experience, are not the ones most in danger of being forgotten today. warnings about the perils of taking any of Lenin's ideas seriously and the dangers of anticipating any kind of system-shaking upheavals, not just in the near future but anytime, anywhere, are commonplace. Pragmatic left-wing of the possible and there is no alternative thinking holds sway, but it is a disservice both to history and today's left to dismiss the new communist movement's experience as entirely negative. Despite a flawed theoretical framework, it managed to maintain itself as a militant anti-capitalist current for longer than most other tendencies that came out of the upheavals of the 1960s. Organizers whose outlook and skills were developed in the movement bolstered numerous important struggles over more than 2 decades, and many continue to do so today. The movement's most sophisticated components survived to make a stronger contribution to the main progressive upsurge of the 1980s, the Jackson Rainbow movement, than any other trend on the socialist left. These accomplishments were possible because the new communist movement was on the right track in several important respects. The movement's strength centered on 3 crucial issues that, albeit in altered form, remain pivotal to any future attempt at left renewal: commitment to internationalism and anti-imperialism, the centrality of the fight against racism, and the urgency of developing cadre and creating organizations capable of mobilizing working people and the oppressed. In its commitment to internationalism, the new communist movement honed in on a central structural feature of contemporary capitalism. This focus provided a crucial counterweight to the national chauvinist, "America is the world's greatest country" outlook that is so incessantly promoted by the establishment and so deeply penetrates U.S. popular political culture. It cleared away the blinders that obscure the systemic connection between the immense wealth of the U.S. and the poverty pervading the global South. And because of the close interrelationship between the world's rich-poor and white-non-white divisions, anti-imperialism also served as a vital corrective to the racist prism through which millions view global realities. The movement's standpoint led to practical activity that materially and politically aided popular movements in other lands and that benefited oppressed people in the U.S. by weakening the common enemy. On the nuts and bolts level, several organizations displayed considerable sophistication in solidarity work and achieved definitive small-scale results. Movement cadre contributed at least their share to the late stages of the anti-Vietnam War movement. In China friendship efforts and in support of struggles in the Philippines, Southern Africa, Palestine, Cuba, and Central America, several groups were able to field an activist core and build a multiracial base, achievements not usually matched by the better-known, frequently all-white peace groups. During its party-building years as well as before and after, The Guardian served as the best U.S.-based source of information about and analysis of national liberation movements. Errors embedded in its anti-revisionist framework compromised these contributions. Acceptance of the CPC's analysis of world politics was their chief mistake, but almost the entire movement tended to gloss over the errors of their favored socialist countries and national liberation movements, and also to underestimate the centrality of the nuclear arsenal to Washington's defense strategy and the consequences of its pursuit of nuclear superiority over the USSR. This led most groups to define internationalist work almost completely in terms of solidarity with national liberation, and hardly at all in terms of opposition to the arms race or the Cold War. Several groups also brought their organization-building agendas into solidarity campaigns in sectarian fashion. These mistakes and similar ones made by other tendencies that stress the centrality of Third World movements are often used as rationales for downplaying or abandoning any imperialism altogether. Sometimes this is done even by activists who appear to stress internationalism. The call to think globally, act locally has stimulated many positive actions, but it has also been used to justify focusing on the narrowest local issues while ignoring the situation of people around the world or even across town. Likewise, many concepts associated with postmodernism, advanced as ways to broaden the scope of progressive activism, in practice translate into everything as equally important perspectives that give lip service to solidarity with the dispossessed, while concentrating on the concerns of people near the top of the world's socioeconomic ladder. Of course, only in part are such notions responsible for the left's drift away from internationalism. The main thing is that U.S. radicals function in a country where both spontaneous common sense and intense ruling class propaganda obscure the roots of global inequality. Unless a self-conscious effort is made to analyze these forces and keep them in the public eye, it is nearly impossible to avoid falling into the trap of national chauvinism. The new communist movement did not get all the specifics right in dealing with this problem, but overall its efforts cut in the right direction. The The shape of world politics has changed tremendously since the early 1970s, and especially since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet bloc. Dramatic technological as well as political changes have produced a so-called new global economy that looks quite different from the capitalism of the 1960s. The US now stands unchallenged in military power, and no strong constellation of left-led third world movements exists or is on the horizon. Nationalism as a political force is playing a very different and much less progressive role in the world than it did 30 years ago, with ethnic exclusivences too often stressed more than any inclusive popular unity against imperial oppressors. These and other new realities mean that there can be no going back to the anti-imperialist strategies and models of the past. And indeed, a search is underway for what is explicitly called a new internationalism by activists in many social movements. Discussion of globalization and its implications is on everyone's lips. Labor and environmental movements as well as the left have begun to target key institutions of global capitalism as antithetical to their interests. Still, those movements' grasp of actual conditions in the global south, much less willingness to put third world needs near the top of the agenda, remains quite undeveloped. It is likewise telling that only small portions of the progressive community take up campaigns against the resurrection of a Star Wars missile system, military aid to Colombia under the guise of fighting drugs, U.S. backing for Israel's apartheid-style disposal of the Palestinians, or the deadly sanctions against Iraq. Still, the rising movement against corporate-led globalization means that conditions to strengthen internationalism are better than they have been in years. A left that can throw itself into this ferment in a non-sectarian manner, while finding ways to challenge national chauvinist blind spots, can make a vital contribution. Constructing such a left requires a layer of activists to internalize sentiments of international solidarity, keep the exploitative and militaristic nature of imperialism in the foreground, and not lose sight of the privileged location of significant sectors of the U.S. population within the unequal structures created by imperialism. It is likewise vital to learn how to bring internationalist campaigns not just to the campuses and churches but directly into working class and people of color constituencies. The new communist movement has positive examples to offer in all of those areas. The centrality of anti-racism. The movement also insisted that challenging the oppression of peoples of color lay at the heart of the revolutionary project, and that people of color movements, the Black Freedom Movement in particular, played a cutting-edge role in driving forward the democratic advance of society as a whole. The new communist movement put the fight for equality at the center of its politics and devoted immense attention to analyzing the history, structures, and pervasive impact of white supremacy. The movement focused attention on the intertwining of class and race relations, drawing out the links between capitalism and racism without reducing racial injustice to a simple quantitative extension of class exploitation. Just about every organization stressed the degree to which movements of peoples of color had an independent, cross-class, and potentially revolutionary character, and thus took a positive approach toward autonomous people of color movements, in particular developing a constructive relationship with revolutionary nationalists. Movement groups gave more attention to the struggles of Asian Americans, Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, and to a certain extent Native Americans than any other socialist trend well into the 1980s. Still, like most other political trends of the period, much of the movement tended to analyze U.S. race relations via black-white paradigm. This was one-sided even considering the unique role the Black liberation movement played in the 1960s and 1970s and the different demographics of that period. Simultaneously, movement groups stressed the importance of winning whites to self-conscious opposition to racism. The movement engaged in a sustained theoretical debate over whether or not it was accurate to speak of white privilege. In the course of this work, several groups developed a sophisticated analysis that noted both the relative advantages whites have over people of color and their deep ideological impact, and the fact that it was in the class interest of all workers to combat racism. The movement shunned the path of least resistance taken by most other multiracial or mainly white left tendencies to base itself in the disproportionately white intelligentsia and professional strata. Instead, it made a sustained effort to sink roots in the more integrated strata of the working class and in communities of color. Anti-revisionists insisted on the need to build multiracial organizations and showed that a group that makes anti-racism a priority in its theory, organizing, and internal life can break deep-rooted patterns of segregation. The most success was achieved by groups that refused to gloss over special oppression in the name of fostering class unity, gave priority to the particular demands of peoples of color, paid careful attention to the racial composition at events or activities, implemented racially conscious cadre training and promotion policies, and published materials in Spanish, Chinese, and other languages. Movement activists drew on the best experience of both the CPUSA and the New Left in facing up to the inevitable tensions that accompany intense day-to-day interactions between people of diverse backgrounds, and in trying to deal with those via education and criticism. Mistakes and weaknesses abounded, but overall movement cadre of all racial and national backgrounds displayed admirable tenacity and insight in this often volatile area. In taking this approach, the movement rejected then widespread arguments for organizing solely on a racially exclusive basis. Conscious of the complexities of moving from a mainly segregated to a unified left, most groups believed that it might be necessary or valuable for autonomous Marxist organizations of color to maintain themselves for at least a temporary period, and for autonomous mass organizations to exist until well after a revolution. But the movement did not make the mistake of thinking that the choice of some activists of color to organize on a racially specific basis expressed a universal sentiment among revolutionaries of color or activists of color more generally. Further, the new communist movement took a principled stand against the thesis that it was acceptable for whites to organize exclusively white organizations, which was adopted implicitly by many white veterans of the New Left and groups such as the New American Movement. While often justified as a way of respecting the independence of people of color movements, in practice this view usually served as a rationalization for avoiding the anti-racist organizing priorities and internal struggles necessary to build a multiracial organization. Even more backward was the position taken by tendencies like Weathermen, which went beyond pragmatic adaptation to all white groups to promote the alleged virtues of recruiting whites as whites into exclusively white organizations. No matter how militant the rhetoric accompanying this posture, or how sincerely anti-racist those who advance it, this view almost invariably ends up, at best, detaching its supporters from the main direction of the anti-racist struggle and, at worst, leading them into a set of unsavory relationships with activists of color. Flowing from their anti-racist outlook, movement cadre threw themselves into the thick of just about every important anti-racist struggle from the late 1960s on. As earlier chapters have described, several groups took backward stances in crucial battles, and the entire movement's ultra-left bent often hindered even the best efforts. Expectations of imminent upsurges kept many groups from patiently developing ties with reform leaders of color, and thus undermined the attempt to build the broad anti-racist front called for in theory. Even so, movement groups led the way in such key 1970s anti-racist battles as the mobilization against the Back Decision. Precisely because they had built a solid anti-racist practice, the main groups that survived into the 1980s were able to contribute much to Jesse Jackson's campaigns and the Rainbow Coalition. Traditional formulas and beyond, by and large, embrace of the Leninist tradition strengthened the movement's anti-racist efforts. Leninism stressed fighting for the particular demands of specially oppressed peoples. It emphasized the value of cross-class alliances in the fight for equality and put the struggles of oppressed peoples within an international context, in particular linking battles here with struggles raging throughout the Third World. It also highlighted the CPUSA's late 1920s break with the Socialist Party's backward refusal to deal with racism as a special question, and thus drew attention to the CPUSA in the 1930s, which contributed more to that decade's anti-racist struggles than any other multiracial or mainly white organization. But there were also elements of what was considered Leninism that had a negative effect. Most of the movement accepted as gospel the proposition that Stalin's 1913 article Marxism and the National Question provided all the theoretical tools necessary to analyze minorities' special oppression. This led to rigidity and perspectives grounded more in European and to a limited extent Third World conditions than realities in the U.S. It discouraged activists from taking U.S. history and society as their analytical starting point, and fostered tortured polemics focusing on whether a particular people, mainly African Americans or Chicanos, fit into Stalin's European-derived definition of a nation. The counterproductive nature of this approach was indicated by the fact that in practice there turned out to be little if any correspondence between a group's decision on whether or not blacks or Chicanos met the criteria for nationhood and that group's stance on concrete issues such as affirmative action or busing. But believing it crucial to stay within the parameters defined by Stalin, many decided that the categories of national oppression were the only legitimate ones to apply to the conditions of non-white peoples. But it is simply not possible to squeeze the full analysis of white supremacy and the oppression of peoples of color into the categories of national oppression. useful as those are in some circumstances. Rather, it is crucial to examine the social relations of racism, including the initial social construction of peculiarly U.S. racial classifications, as they have evolved and intertwined with the country's political economy. The very terminology, people of color, used by millions today to describe what most anti-revisionists call the oppressed nationalities, is telling confirmation of this point. Most Marxist-Leninists were reluctant to enter such territory, however, seeing mainly a danger of revisionism. By and large, those tendencies willing to push furthest toward or beyond the boundaries of this framework produce the most insightful historical and theoretical analyses. Of course, no one in the movement produced the definitive work on the nature of U.S. racism and the path to overcoming it. And even the best material from the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s needs to be reviewed in light of major changes in U.S. race relations and how they intersect with employment, income, housing, education, and other patterns. Especially important are major demographic shifts, the growing weight of immigrant labor within the working class, the projection that Latinos will soon become the nation's largest racial ethnic minority, that Asians and Pacific Islanders are the most rapidly growing population in many regions, that the Arab American community has attained numbers and a presence to be reckoned with, and that people of color are predicted to outnumber whites within a few decades. People of mixed racial descent are also carving out a new social space and identity that demands analytical and political consideration. So does the recent upswing in Native American and Hawaiian peoples' activism and the growing links between indigenous peoples' movements worldwide. The outpouring of new theoretical and empirical work on racism, as well as the intersections of race, class, and gender, and the relatively recent effort to cast a spotlight on the problematic nature of whiteness via white studies, demonstrates how much remains to be explored in this area. Yet if the specific contours of racism have evolved, this only makes it more true that anti-racism must be central to any U.S. radical project. This is a lesson that has never been truly learned by U.S. social democracy or by postmodernism. Indeed, when it comes to the matter of racism, the ideological assault both social democracy and postmodernism have mounted against all branches of the communist tradition serves mainly to rationalize not giving the central axis of U.S. society the attention it requires. Under the guise of attacking Marxism-Leninist reductionism, such thinking sidesteps the need to make tough choices, or sometimes any choices about strategic priorities, leaving racism spontaneously on the back burner. Given the alternatives on offer, 1990s activists could do far worse than look to the efforts of the new communist movement as they search for ways to build anti-racism into the bedrock of a renewed U.S. left. The movement offers far fewer positive lessons for the fight against women's oppression. With a few notable exceptions, anti-revisionist groups presented only superficial theoretical analyses of male supremacy and took a sectarian stance toward most of the women's liberation movement. They were responding in part to a powerful tendency in the early 1970s women's movement to separate the fight against sexism from the anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles of that period. But rather than work toward an approach that theoretically connected and practically united these struggles, the new communist movement fell into its own version of counterposing one against the other. The experience of virtually every social movement since that time has proved the dead-end character of such a perspective, and an extensive body of theoretical work mainly by women of color has demonstrated both the depth of sexism's impact on the most oppressed layers of the population and the need for a strategy that confronts class exploitation, racism, and sexism as interconnected structurally and ideologically. No revitalization of the socialist movement can take place unless it incorporates this vision. It is likewise absolutely necessary to criticize and move beyond the homophobia that predominated in the new communist milieu, and to recognize the validity and importance of struggles for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender rights, cadre, and organization. For all the criticism this volume has leveled at the dangers of sect building, it remains true that the new communist movement was onto something in its dogged efforts to develop cadre and form disciplined organizations. Confronted with the more advanced tasks, heightened protests, and increased repression of the late 1960s, the radical organizations that had spearheaded the New Left, SNCC and SDS especially, fragmented and collapsed. The search for new organizational forms was not driven by any narrow ideological agenda, but by the energy of thousands who concluded from their direct experience that more advanced models were needed. They were enthusiastic about the vanguard cadre model because it seemed best suited to the tasks at hand. This model spoke to the widespread feeling that broad mass movements could only consolidate their gains if they were reinforced by a body of cadre who had the theoretical understanding, political commitment, and practical skills to navigate the twists and turns of complex political battles. In contrast to perspectives on organization that obscure the degree to which every project, from trade unions to liberal electoral campaigns, relies on cadre to advance its goals, Leninism called for facing this reality and appropriating it for socialism. In melding cadre together into a unified organization, Leninism's requirement that every member participate in advancing an agreed-upon program allowed groups to coordinate multi-sector nationwide campaigns and fostered genuine camaraderie. The Leninist stricture that every revolutionary must be responsible to a party unit initially served as a positive corrective to the problems many had experienced in looser New Left groups, whose work was badly hurt by the unaccountable actions of media-created leaders or by the refusal of a numerical minority to abide by the will of the majority. The movement's organizational methods also proved valuable in turning the call for multiracial organizations into a reality. They helped movement groups to bridge barriers of class background and educational experience, and to link academics with community and workplace organizers. Struggles were waged against elitist attitudes manifested by middle-class intellectuals, and measures were taken to guarantee that workers had time for study and political assignments that would develop their leadership capacities. Though there were bureaucratic abuses, the most sophisticated groups achieved far more in these areas than left organizations that eschewed internal struggle in the name of being open and accessible. And the early stages of most organizations' development were characterized by considerable democracy and intellectual excitement. The initial process of hammering out an organization's perspective was usually carried out with broad-based participation. Forums and debates both within and between organizations were common in the movement's early years, and during the late 1970s formative stages of the second wave groups, emphasis on the vanguard nature of the party likewise contributed to the initial appeal of the Leninist model. It encouraged activists to think in broad, long-range terms, to ponder all dimensions of the class struggle, to take their work and themselves seriously, to assume a great deal of responsibility and push themselves to their limits. It nurtured audacity. For such qualities, movement cadre won grudging respect even from harsh critics of their ideology, avoiding sectarian dead ends. In the end, the flaws in the movement's model overwhelmed its positive features. Efforts to maintain a high level of activism turned into a formula for trapping members in a self-contained world and or burning them out. Insistence on group solidarity and discipline degenerated into suppression of internal democracy. Mandates to struggle against backward ideas became the justification for constant intergroup warfare. This organizational degeneration was bound up with the Stalin-Mao party model, with its rigid top-down structure and insistence that loyalty to Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy was the key to vanguard status. Yet on another level, it was connected to the problems of maintaining any kind of revolutionary organization in a period where large constituencies do not support revolutionary politics, and no revolutionary situation is likely for many years to come. Such conditions create difficulties that no organizational model, however creative and flexible, can completely overcome. Without a large, active and anti-capitalist social base to draw strength from, interact with and be held accountable to, left organizations face profound dilemmas. Pressures to surrender revolutionary politics in order to make an immediate impact on public policy are immense. On the other hand, groups determined to resist the rightward pull find that even survival, much less growth, is no easy task. Temptations to retreat into a small but secure niche on the margins of politics and or confine oneself to revolutionary propaganda are extremely great. So is the impulse to rely on purer-than-thou fidelity to old orthodox, ease to maintain membership morale, ensure organizational cohesion, and compete with other groups. As Marx himself put it, when the working class is not yet ripe for an independent historical movement, it will be a period of socialist sectarianism. Given such conditions, it is not easy to chart a course that could preserve the positive features of the movement's organizational practice, cadre development, comradely solidarity, capacity to coordinate ambitious campaigns, and so on, while avoiding the ultimately decisive negatives. But a few clues can be gleaned from the party builder's experience. By and large, in the movement's healthiest periods, several organizations, both tight-knit cadre groups and other forms, coexisted and interacted while considering themselves part of a common political trend. In such periods, the movement was able to field and train disciplined bodies of cadre in coordinated campaigns, but also retain flexibility. It also had constant incentive for lively internal debate. Diversity of organizational forms, publishing collectives, research centers, cultural collectives, and broad organizing networks, in addition to local and national cadre formations, along with a dynamic interaction between them, supplied, at least to a degree, some of the pressures for democracy and realism that in other situations flowed from a socialist-oriented working class. It freed the movement from pressures to adopt a uniform approach in all sectors during a period where tremendous disparities in consciousness and activity meant that uniformity would be inherently self-defeating. In contrast, the movement suffered when one group after another decided that Leninism demanded bringing every organizational initiative under the control of a single centralized leadership. In the short run, such methods produced tight, efficient organizations. But these lacked any substantial social base and were almost by definition hostile to all others on the left. They could never break out of the limits of a sect. Groups took this path not just because of general ultra-leftism or sectarianism. They accepted the mechanical notion that the way to create a large revolutionary party down the road was to build a small revolutionary party, a party in embryo today. This strategy ignored the fact that vast differences in size and scale, for example between 100 members and 10,000, and between a base in the millions and a base numbering just a few thousand, have qualitative rather than just quantitative effects not just on strategy but on organizational models. It blinded movement activists to Lenin's view that a revolutionary party must not only be an advanced detachment, but must also actually represent and be rooted in a substantial socialist-leaning wing of the working class. It meant that the new communist movement did not seriously consider more complex but more realistic paths to the eventual construction of a relevant revolutionary party, which involved not only significant realignment within the left but large-scale shifts of working-class opinion and other changes that are not fully or even mainly under the left's control. Even in periods of political ebb, it is crucial to build organizations and institutions. Without collective forms, it is impossible to train cadre, debate theory and strategy, spread information and analysis, or engage fully with the urgent struggles of the day. Only through organizations can revolutionaries maximize their contribution to ongoing battles and position themselves to maximally influence events when new mass upheavals and opportunities arise. But it is fatal to forget that the actual state of the working class movement sets limits on the nature of left organization, and that while revolutionaries can influence the consciousness and direction of large-scale mass movements, they cannot through their own efforts create such movements in the first place. Even beyond the particular requirements of periods when mass movements are in ebb and no mass base for socialism is on the horizon, many aspects of what the new communist movement considered orthodox Leninism need to be discarded. First, the proposition that one party alone can embody revolutionary working-class politics in a given country does not hold up. It remains valid for organizations to aspire to political leadership and strive to develop a body of cadre with a deep sense of historical responsibility, a willingness to sacrifice, and general audacity, but tying this stance to the notion of an exclusive vanguard, a party ordained to lead by history, ideology, or franchise, is a formula for sectarianism and anti-democratic practices. In most cases, organizations with this view have never grown to be more than marginal sects. In the relatively few where one has not only attained mass influence but actually seized power, the price paid after the revolution has been prohibitively high. Second, basing an organization's unity on an ideological system, say Marxism-Leninism, rather than a political program, say socialism, is fraught with danger. Marxist theory can provide crucial insights to inform current practice, but enshrining any kind of inherited doctrine at the center of an organization's identity fosters a pattern of trying to justify all current assessments and innovations as consistent with past orthodoxy. The result is a strong pull not just toward dogmatism, but toward constant suspicion of heresy. Finally, while very general concepts like social revolution might serve as a starting point, to make any practical headway it is absolutely necessary to develop a concrete conception of how to intervene in U.S. politics and a set of intermediate or transitional goals. The new communist experience has some useful experience to offer here. Much can be learned, for example, from the analysis behind the United Front Against War and Racism. the evolution of the Rainbow Coalition still sheds a great deal of light on the complexities of consolidating a progressive pole in U.S. politics. And especially in the wake of the year 2000 elections, with virtually the entire left debating electoral strategies and/or the relationship between electoral and non-electoral organizing, the perspective and experience of the 1980s Rainbow Left, and the overlapping left wing of the Harold Washington Coalition in Chicago, is well worth a serious examination. Re-legitimizing revolutionary politics. Of course, revitalizing the left is not strictly or even primarily an organizational task. The socialist movement needs a full top-to-bottom overhaul, not just in the US but worldwide, for the sea changes that occurred a decade ago were not simply one more in the long series of twists and turns that have shaped socialism's history. Rather, they brought a whole epoch that began in 1917, if not 1848, to an end. As Eric Hobsbawm put it, there can be no serious doubt that in the late 1980s and early 1990s an era in world history ended and a new one began. Certainly a host of continuities links today's radical efforts to those of their predecessors, but the scope, scale, and depth of the changes that have occurred mean that more than a few adjustments or updates of past perspectives and models are needed for a left confronted by new realities and willing to face up to the decidedly mixed balance sheet of its own past. Fresh analyses, new strategies, and new models are required. Developing effective ones will involve drawing on the best of many Marxist and non-Marxist radical traditions, but above all will require a hard-headed look at today's realities, willingness to explore new theoretical terrain, and a good deal of flexibility and experimentation in practical campaigns. What is encouraging is that efforts to make a fresh start have been underway from different directions for many years now. Some began when it first became clear that the hopes many entertained coming out of the 1960s were not going to be realized, and re-examination intensified many-fold after the collapse of the USSR and the Tiananmen Square massacre. Today, from Italy to South Africa, from Brazil to South Korea, indeed across the globe, veterans of past battles and a new generation of activists are searching for new paths. In the most dynamic of these efforts, militants holding a wide range of opinions are finding ways to cooperate and learn from one another. In many cases, Mexico's Zapatistas stand out in this regard. Organizations have called for a fundamental rethinking of the pre-1989 left's dominant views on the relationship between revolutionary organizations and civil society, and of the very nature of the struggle for political power. Though many in the US and other countries who were engaged in this quest in the early 1990s have stepped back in fatigue or disillusionment, there are signs that the worst period of left discouragement may be passing, the spotlight now being shined on the inequities of global capitalism, symbolized especially by the Seattle anti-WTO protests, indicates that the political logjams of the 1990s may be beginning to break up. New openings exist to re-legitimize anti-capitalist politics. To take advantage of those openings, revolutionaries must attain a far deeper understanding of contemporary society. Attention especially has to be focused on the new developments that are daily transforming today's ever-smaller world. Issues surrounding the environment and the urgency of its protection, the impact of tremendous scientific and technological changes, U.S. society's rapidly changing demographics, to name only a few, require in-depth research and analysis. The revolutionary left will never be at the political forefront of popular movements if it is not at the intellectual forefront of analyzing modern society. Likewise, the left needs a burst of new thinking and experimentation to establish a higher standard of democracy and egalitarianism within its ranks. Whatever assessment the next decade's left makes of the system-threatening potential of different movements at different moments, no revolutionary project will thrive unless relations within it are more democratic and more equal across the barriers of race, class, gender, and sexuality than previously. The left also needs to recast its organizing techniques given new occupational patterns, changed relationships between home and workplace, and new forms of media and communication technology. Then there's the matter of revolutionaries participating in practical day-to-day struggles. For all the initiative held today by big capital and the right wing, the number and variety of grassroots organizing projects is probably greater than at any time in U.S. history. Even short of another surge of mass protest, a great deal can be done to strengthen and link these efforts. Victories can be won that make an immediate difference in the lives of millions and strengthen the political capacity of popular constituencies. Beyond the crucial importance of these battles in their own right, it is simply impossible to conceive of a revitalized revolutionary current unless the people advocating it are immersed in these struggles. It is only in this context that building revolutionary organizations makes any sense. If headway is made on the theoretical front, if egalitarian relations between activists are being forged, if revolutionary-minded individuals are immersed in vital mass struggles and sustain cooperative relationships with the rich diversity of progressive forces, then organizations can contribute to these processes. They can link different kinds of work and break the cycle of particular struggles rising and falling without leaving any vehicle to provide continuity of experience. They can provide favorable conditions for activists to mature into skilled cadre with a lifetime commitment to fundamental social change. They can serve as a much-needed focal point to bind together the tasks of understanding the world and changing it. The young activists who built the new communist movement put those concepts at the center of their vision. They tried to mesh the political tenacity of the old left and the fervor of the new left into a powerful revolutionary party, but they became mired in dogmatist orthodoxy and moralistic intolerance, reproducing the worst traits of their predecessors instead of their strengths. They ended up making party building a fetish and constructed only sex. This book has been written partly to identify the markers on that slippery slope to sectarian irrelevance in hopes of better equipping a new generation to take a different path. But an equally important goal has been to call attention to the ways in which dedication to constructing a revolutionary apparatus can act as a potent positive force, unleashing individual creativity, building solidarity across socially imposed barriers, stimulating theoretical exploration, and strengthening activists' commitment to peace and freedom. Fundamentally, that is why a significant section of the generation that turned to radicalism in the 1960s thought that building a new communist party was a crucial step on the road to revolutionary change.